Welcome back to Mystery Minds, the channel where we dive into the darkest corners of true crime, uncovering stories that shock, intrigue, and leave us questioning the world around us. In today's case, we bring you a chilling and twisted tale, one of ambition, corruption, and a deadly reign of terror. This is the story of Diego Alvarez, the most feared drug trafficker in the history of crime. A tale of power, betrayal, and ultimate downfall. This case will leave you wondering, how does one man rise to the pinnacle of a global empire, only to face the harsh reality of the world he's built crumbling beneath him? And how does a single empire leave behind a legacy of violence that still echoes through the streets today? Stay with us as we unravel the gripping and terrifying story of Diego Alvarez, the Kingpin whose empire forever changed the world of organized crime. The body of a man was found on a deserted beach in Cartagena, Colombia, in the summer of 2022. Authorities immediately recognized the victim as Lucas Ortega, a notorious middleman in the drug trade. His hands were bound, his face battered, and his chest carved with the ominous initials DA. The case sent shockwaves through the underworld. Though Alvarez had been presumed dead for nearly a decade, whispers of his return rippled through criminal networks worldwide. Had the ghost of the drug trade's most ruthless kingpin come back to reclaim his empire? Diego Alvarez's story began in the chaotic streets of Medellin, Colombia, during the 1980s, a time when the city was both a battleground and a breeding ground for criminals. Born into abject poverty, Diego was one of 5 siblings crammed into a dilapidated shack on the outskirts of the city. His father, a factory worker with a penchant for drinking, disappeared when Diego was just 6. His mother, overburdened and under-resourced, tried to provide for her children by working as a street vendor, but her efforts were never enough. Hunger was a constant companion, and survival was a daily challenge. By the age of 10, Diego had learned what desperation felt like. He scavenged for food in garbage dumps, sold trinkets on street corners, and carried an ever-present sense of anger toward the world. His breaking point came one night when local enforcers working for a small-time drug lord demanded protection money from his mother. When she couldn't pay, they beat her in front of Diego and his siblings. The event burned itself into Diego's memory, leaving him with an unshakable conviction. Power was the only way to escape vulnerability. Diego's first brush with violence came shortly after. A debt collector, sent by the same gang, cornered Diego's older sister in an alley. With no thought other than protecting his family, Diego picked up a piece of broken glass and attacked the man. The act was crude but effective, leaving the collector with deep cuts and an unforgettable lesson. Though terrified, Diego felt a spark of something he couldn't name, a mixture of adrenaline and a sense of control he had never experienced before. The streets of Medellin were not forgiving, but for someone like Diego, they offered opportunities. Petty thefts turned into more calculated robberies, and by his early teens, he had joined a local gang. He quickly demonstrated a sharp mind for strategy and an unmatched willingness to act ruthlessly when necessary. When a rival gang began muscling into their territory, Diego devised a plan that ended in the ambush and elimination of their leader. It wasn't long before older gang members started treating him as more than a foot soldier. Diego's rise within the gang attracted attention. Miguel Santoro, a mid-level drug trafficker, took notice of the fearless teenager. Santoro saw potential in Diego, a combination of intelligence and ruthlessness that could be shaped into something powerful. He brought Diego into his fold, giving him tasks that tested his loyalty and skill. From delivering small packages to negotiating deals with local suppliers, Diego proved himself time and time again. He wasn't just efficient, he was ambitious. Each task became a stepping stone, and Diego ensured that his name was synonymous with reliability and results. As Diego climbed the ranks, he learned the intricacies of the drug trade. He observed how cocaine was processed in clandestine labs hidden deep in the jungle, how routes were secured through a mix of bribery and intimidation, and how loyalty was bought with money, but maintained through fear. Diego absorbed it all, storing away every piece of information like a sponge. He didn't just want to work for the cartel, he wanted to control it. By the time Diego was 20, he had carved out a reputation as Santoro's most trusted operative. But trust in the criminal world was a fragile thing. Diego understood this and began plotting his next move. Santoro, though competent, lacked the vision Diego believed was necessary to expand the operation. The older man was content with his modest empire, but Diego saw potential for something far greater. He began quietly building alliances within the organization, gaining the support of those who felt overlooked or undervalued under Santoro's leadership. The turning point came in the form of a shipment that went missing. Santoro blamed a rival gang and prepared for retaliation, but Diego had other suspicions. Conducting his own investigation, he uncovered the truth. A senior member of their own cartel had orchestrated the theft, planning to sell the product independently. Diego presented the evidence to Santoro, but with a twist. He framed it as a crisis requiring decisive action Santoro wasn't prepared to take. In Diego's hands, the traitor was dealt with swiftly and brutally. A message to anyone considering betrayal. The move cemented his authority within the organization, even as Santoro began to sense the younger man's growing influence. Diego's coup was subtle but inevitable. Over months, he eroded Santoro's power, convincing key players within the cartel to shift their loyalty. When the time came to make his move, it was swift and bloodless. Santoro was quietly removed from the picture, exiled rather than killed, a rare mercy in the drug world. Diego's reasoning was simple. Killing Santoro would make him a martyr, while banishment would turn him into a forgotten relic. With Santoro out of the way, Diego took control. His first act as leader was to overhaul the organization's operations. He streamlined the supply chain, cutting out unnecessary intermediaries and increasing profits. He expanded distribution routes, forging partnerships with gangs in Central America and the United States. But Diego didn't just focus on logistics, he understood the value of perception. Under his rule, the cartel became known for its ruthlessness. Rivals weren't just defeated, they were annihilated, their deaths turned into public spectacles that served as warnings. Diego's message was clear. Opposition was not just futile but suicidal. Within a few years, Diego Alvarez had transformed the cartel into a force that dominated Medellin and beyond. His methods were brutal, but they worked. For someone who had grown up powerless, Diego reveled in his newfound control. He wasn't just surviving anymore, he was thriving, and nothing was going to stand in his way. Under Diego Alvarez's leadership, the cartel he inherited transformed into an international powerhouse. What had once been a regional operation quickly expanded into a multi-billion-dollar enterprise. Diego's vision extended far beyond the borders of Colombia. He understood that to dominate the drug trade, he needed control over not just production but also transportation, distribution, and protection. Every link in the chain had to belong to him, and every rival who stood in his way had to be eliminated. Diego's empire thrived on efficiency. He invested heavily in cocaine production, constructing state-of-the-art labs hidden deep within the Colombian jungle. These facilities operated around the clock, staffed by chemists, armed guards, and local farmers paid far more than they could earn growing traditional crops. Entire communities became dependent on Diego's operations, ensuring their loyalty. Farmers who resisted had their land burned to ash, their families threatened, or worse. From the jungles, the product traveled along meticulously planned routes. Diego pioneered a network that combined traditional smuggling methods with cutting-edge innovation. His cartel employed submarines to evade radar detection, utilized remote-controlled drones to transport smaller shipments, and bribed officials at every major checkpoint. Corruption became a cornerstone of his operation. Police officers, customs agents, and even politicians received generous payouts to turn a blind eye. Diego's influence reached so far that some officials actively facilitated his operations, ensuring smooth passage for his shipments. In cities across Central America, his cartel formed alliances with local gangs, offering protection and a share of profits in exchange for cooperation. These partnerships allowed Diego to dominate key transit points, ensuring his product moved unimpeded toward the United States, the most lucrative market of all. His reach extended into Europe as well, where high demand and lax regulation in certain ports created opportunities for expansion. By the early 2000s, Diego Alvarez's organization was moving hundreds of tons of cocaine annually, generating profits that rivaled legitimate multinational corporations. What set Diego apart was not just his business acumen, but his unrelenting ruthlessness. Competitors were not merely defeated, they were obliterated in ways designed to send a clear message. In one infamous incident, a rival cartel attempted to undercut Diego's prices, stealing clients in the process. Diego responded by orchestrating a bombing that targeted the rival leader's convoy. The explosion, which killed over 50 people, made headlines around the world. Though authorities condemned the act, the underlying message to other traffickers was clear. Crossing Diego Alvarez came at an unbearable cost. Fear became Diego's most powerful weapon. His brutality was matched only by his cunning. He understood that violence alone wasn't enough to sustain his empire. It had to be paired with loyalty, and loyalty was built on trust, money, and fear of betrayal. He paid his workers and enforcers generously, offering bonuses for exceptional performance and care packages for their families. But for those who betrayed him, the punishment was swift and public. Over time, rumors of his gruesome methods began to circulate. Stories of disloyal lieutenants who were tortured or executed in unimaginable ways spread like wildfire, reinforcing the legend of Diego Alvarez as an untouchable and merciless figure. Despite his reputation, Diego wasn't invincible. Law enforcement agencies around the world began to take notice of his growing empire. The United States, in particular, saw his cartel as a major threat. Launching joint operations with Colombian authorities to dismantle it, raids on jungle labs became more frequent, and high-ranking members of his organization were arrested or killed. But Diego was always one step ahead. He employed a vast network of informants who kept him aware of impending operations, allowing him to evade capture time and time again. As the pressure mounted, Diego adapted. He began delegating more responsibilities to trusted lieutenants, creating layers of separation between himself and the day-to-day operations of the cartel. This made it harder for authorities to pin anything directly on him. He also diversified his business, investing in legitimate ventures as a means of laundering money, and creating a facade of respectability. Through shell companies and offshore accounts, Diego funneled billions of dollars into real estate, shipping, and luxury goods. To the outside world, he appeared to be a successful entrepreneur, a man who had risen from nothing to achieve greatness. However, the cracks in his empire were never far from view. With so much money and power at stake, rivalries within the organization began to emerge. Some lieutenants grew resentful of Diego's iron-fisted rule, questioning whether his methods were sustainable. Others saw opportunities to take what he had built for themselves. Diego, ever the strategist, kept a close eye on potential threats, using a combination of surveillance and spies to root out dissent. Yet even he couldn't control everything. One of the most significant challenges came from outside his organization. Rival cartels, jealous of Diego's success, formed alliances to challenge his dominance. These coalitions brought new levels of violence to the drug trade. Entire neighborhoods were turned into war zones as competing factions fought for control. For every move Diego made, his enemies countered with equal ferocity. Bombings, assassinations, and kidnappings became commonplace, leaving civilians caught in the crossfire. The Colombian government, overwhelmed by the escalating violence, declared war on the cartels, deploying military forces to crack down on the drug trade. Diego thrived in chaos, using the government's actions to his advantage. He portrayed himself as a man of the people, funding schools, hospitals, and infrastructure projects in impoverished areas affected by the violence. While these gestures were purely strategic, they earned him the loyalty of local communities who saw him as a protector rather than a criminal. This duality, ruthless kingpin and benevolent benefactor, cemented his status as a figure both feared and revered. By the mid-2000s, Diego Alvarez was at the peak of his power. His cartel controlled an estimated 60% of the cocaine trade, generating unimaginable wealth. Yet his success came at a cost. The weight of constant vigilance, the need to stay ahead of both rivals and law enforcement, and the paranoia of potential betrayal began to take their toll. Diego's once calculated approach grew more erratic. He became increasingly suspicious of those around him, trusting fewer and fewer people. This paranoia would sow the seeds of his eventual downfall. But for now, Diego remained on top, a king in a kingdom built on blood and fear. In 2011, a shipment valued at over $300 million vanished while en route from Colombia to Mexico. For Diego Alvarez, this wasn't just a financial setback, it was a potential crack in the foundation of his empire. Alvarez's cartel was built on precision and control, and such a monumental loss sent shockwaves through his organization. Initial investigations pointed to the usual suspects, rival cartels or a law enforcement sting. However, as Alvarez's men delved deeper, it became clear that this betrayal had come from within. The betrayal was orchestrated by Victor Ramos, one of Diego's most trusted lieutenants. Ramos had risen through the ranks under Diego's leadership and had access to critical information about the cartel's operations. He had secretly been collaborating with U.S. authorities, providing them with intelligence in exchange for protection and promises of immunity. It was Ramos who had leaked the shipment's route, allowing it to be intercepted. The revelation struck at the heart of Diego's empire, not only because of the financial loss but because it exposed vulnerabilities he had long denied existed. Diego's response was swift and merciless. He ordered an internal purge, targeting anyone suspected of disloyalty. It began with those closest to Ramos, his associates, family members, and anyone who had worked under him. These individuals disappeared one by one, their fates serving as a stark warning to the rest of the organization. Diego's paranoia grew, and the ripple effects of this betrayal began to erode the stability of his empire. Trust, once a currency that had bound his operation together, became scarce. Meanwhile, law enforcement agencies capitalized on the chaos within the cartel. With Ramos's cooperation, they launched a series of high-profile raids targeting Diego's operations. Warehouses were seized, cocaine labs destroyed, and key members arrested. The losses were substantial, and Diego found himself fighting battles on multiple fronts. His empire, which had once seemed unshakable, began to show signs of strain. In response, Diego retreated further into the shadows. He rarely appeared in public, conducting business through layers of intermediaries to avoid detection. His whereabouts became a mystery, even to many within his own organization. This created a vacuum at the top, leading to power struggles among his lieutenants. Some saw his absence as a sign of weakness and began jockeying for control. Others questioned his ability to lead in the face of mounting challenges. Amid the internal turmoil, Diego launched a campaign to reassert his dominance. He struck deals with smaller, rival cartels, offering them protection and a share of profits in exchange for loyalty. This move allowed him to stabilize parts of his operation, but it also came with risks. These alliances were fragile, held together by mutual interest rather than trust. Diego knew that any sign of weakness could shatter them, so he doubled down on his reputation for ruthlessness. One of the most chilling examples of his resolve came when a former ally attempted to defect to a rival organization. Diego tracked him down and had him executed in a manner designed to send a message. The man's body was found hanging from a bridge, mutilated and surrounded by signs bearing Diego's initials. The act was a brutal reminder of his reach and the consequences of betrayal, but it also underscored the lengths he was willing to go to maintain control. Even as Diego fought to preserve his empire, he faced mounting pressure from international law enforcement. The United States, frustrated by years of evasion, increased its efforts to capture him. Joint operations with Colombian authorities intensified, with millions of dollars poured into intelligence gathering and surveillance. They tracked his financial transactions, intercepted communications, and infiltrated his organization. Despite these efforts, Diego remained elusive, always staying one step ahead. However, his ability to evade capture came at a cost. The constant pressure forced him to make decisions that weakened his position. He moved his base of operations frequently, relying on a smaller, more trusted circle of advisors. This reduced his ability to oversee the day-to-day activities of his cartel, creating inefficiencies and opening the door for further betrayal. His paranoia deepened, and the once charismatic leader became increasingly isolated. By 2013, the strain of leadership had begun to take a visible toll on Diego. The losses from the Ramos betrayal and subsequent raids had significantly diminished his resources. Many of his lieutenants, once fiercely loyal, had either been arrested, killed, or turned against him. The alliances he had forged with smaller cartels were beginning to fracture under the weight of external pressure and internal distrust. His enemies sensed an opportunity and launched coordinated attacks on his remaining operations, further destabilizing his empire. The breaking point came when Diego's private jet was discovered abandoned in the Amazon jungle. The discovery sparked a media frenzy, with authorities speculating that he had died in a desperate attempt to escape capture. The wreckage bore signs of a forced landing, but no bodies were found. For weeks, search teams combed the area, but their efforts yielded no definitive answers. The lack of closure fueled rumors and speculation. Some believed he had succumbed to the dangers of the jungle, while others were convinced he had staged his own death to disappear entirely. Diego's disappearance marked the end of an era for his cartel. Without his leadership, the organization splintered into factions, each vying for control. The resulting power vacuum led to a surge in violence as former allies turned on one another. The Colombian government, seizing the opportunity, launched a crackdown that dismantled much of what remained of the cartel. For many, it seemed that Diego Alvarez's reign of terror had finally come to an end. However, whispers of his survival persisted. In the underworld, his name continued to inspire both fear and respect. Stories emerged of sightings in far-flung locations, from luxury villas in Dubai to remote islands in the Caribbean. Offshore accounts linked to him remained active, with funds flowing to known cartel fronts. These clues, while inconclusive, kept the legend of Diego Alvarez alive. Whether he was dead or merely in hiding, his influence continued to cast a long shadow over the world of organized crime. Months after Diego Alvarez's mysterious disappearance, the world of organized crime began to shift in unexpected ways. In the absence of its infamous leader, Diego's cartel fractured into smaller factions, each led by ambitious lieutenants eager to claim the throne. These factions were plagued by infighting and power struggles, and without Diego's unifying control, their operations became disorganized and vulnerable. Law enforcement agencies seized the opportunity, dismantling much of what remained of the once dominant cartel. But while the official narrative suggested Diego's empire was crumbling, a different story was quietly unfolding beneath the surface. In certain criminal circles, rumors began to circulate about a figure operating in the shadows. The figure was described as a ghost, someone who moved silently but left behind a trail of influence and fear. This ghost was said to have deep pockets and an uncanny ability to predict his rivals' moves. He was rebuilding, not with the reckless ambition of his earlier years, but with precision and caution, learning from the mistakes that had nearly destroyed him. What no one knew was that Diego Alvarez had indeed survived the supposed plane crash. The jet had been intentionally abandoned as part of an elaborate plan to fake his death. For months before the incident, Diego had been preparing for his disappearance, siphoning funds into offshore accounts, creating false identities, and establishing safe havens in remote parts of the world. When the time came, he slipped away with a handful of trusted associates, leaving behind a trail of destruction to cover his escape. Diego's retreat was not a surrender but a strategic withdrawal. He understood that his survival depended on staying out of the spotlight and avoiding the mistakes that had made him a target. For the first time in decades, Diego stepped back from direct control of his operations. He adopted a new role as a silent puppet master, orchestrating events from the shadows while allowing others to act as the public face of his organization. His first step was to identify and eliminate the greatest threats to his return. Rival factions that had splintered from his cartel were targeted with surgical precision. Diego deployed hired mercenaries and rogue intelligence agents to strike at his enemies, using tactics that left no trace of his involvement. Key figures disappeared overnight, their territories absorbed into Diego's growing network. With every move, he strengthened his position while maintaining the illusion of his absence. Diego also rebuilt his financial empire, using the extensive network of offshore accounts he had cultivated over the years. He funneled money into legitimate businesses, creating a web of companies that served as fronts for his illicit activities. These businesses ranged from luxury resorts to tech startups, allowing him to launder his profits while staying hidden. Through intermediaries, Diego began to re-establish control over cocaine production and distribution, using his wealth to buy loyalty and secure his roots. As his power grew, Diego focused on adapting to the changing landscape of the drug trade. He recognized that the old methods of trafficking, relying on physical shipments and corrupt officials, were becoming increasingly risky. Law enforcement agencies were employing advanced technology to track and intercept shipments, making traditional smuggling routes more vulnerable. Diego responded by investing in innovation, hiring engineers and hackers to develop new methods of evasion. His cartel began using encrypted communication networks, GPS jamming devices, and drones to move product across borders undetected. Diego also expanded into synthetic drugs, recognizing their growing demand in international markets. By diversifying his product line, he reduced his reliance on cocaine and tapped into new revenue streams. This move allowed him to stay ahead of his competitors, many of whom were still reliant on outdated methods and products. Diego's ability to adapt and evolve was a testament to his strategic brilliance, ensuring his survival in an increasingly hostile environment. But even as Diego rebuilt his empire, he faced new challenges. The alliances he had formed to regain control were fragile, held together by mutual interest rather than loyalty. To maintain these relationships, Diego relied on a combination of fear and incentives, rewarding loyalty with wealth and punishing betrayal with swift retribution. He also faced growing competition from emerging cartels, many of which were led by younger, more reckless leaders eager to make a name for themselves. These rivals lacked Diego's discipline and experience, but their unpredictability made them dangerous. As Diego consolidated his power, law enforcement agencies began to suspect that he was still alive. The precision and sophistication of the attacks on his rivals, combined with the resurgence of his cartel, suggested the hand of a master strategist. Interpol and the DEA launched new investigations, tracking the flow of money and resources in an effort to uncover Diego's whereabouts. They were met with frustration as Diego's operations remained impenetrable, protected by layers of intermediaries and false leads. Diego's ability to stay ahead of his pursuers was a testament to his unparalleled intellect and foresight. He operated like a chess grandmaster, always thinking several moves ahead. Every decision was calculated, every risk weighed against potential rewards. He avoided the hubris that had nearly destroyed him in the past, keeping his circle of confidants small and his operations decentralized. Diego knew that his survival depended on maintaining this discipline, even as his empire grew larger and more powerful. By 2015, Diego Alvarez had achieved what many believed to be impossible. He had rebuilt his empire from the ground up, creating a criminal network that was more efficient and resilient than ever before. But this time he ruled from the shadows, ensuring that his name remained a ghostly whisper rather than a headline. For Diego, this new approach was not just a strategy for survival, but a way to reclaim his legacy. He was no longer just a drug lord. He was a legend, a figure who had transcended the limitations of mortality to become a symbol of power and fear. As he sat in a secluded villa overlooking the Caribbean Sea, Diego reflected on the journey that had brought him to this moment. He had risen from poverty to become one of the most powerful men in the world, only to lose everything and claw his way back from the brink. His story was one of survival and reinvention, a testament to his resilience and determination. But even as he savored his triumph, Diego knew that his enemies were still out there, waiting for the slightest sign of weakness. For a man like Diego Alvarez, there could be no rest, only the endless pursuit of power and control. The reemergence of Diego Alvarez as a shadowy yet dominant force in the global drug trade brought with it an air of invincibility that few could rival. Though his empire operated under layers of anonymity, The results of his influence were evident in the underworld. A sudden ruthless efficiency across routes that had once been chaotic, the rapid disappearance of rivals who dared to challenge certain territories, and a resurgence of cocaine supply in regions that had been left desolate by the fall of his original cartel. Diego, however, was not content to simply rebuild. He sought a legacy that would transcend the cycles of rise and fall that defined so many drug lords before him. Diego's strategy evolved as he began focusing on diversifying his operations beyond cocaine. He was no longer just a drug trafficker. He became a master of multiple illicit trades. From synthetic drugs to arms dealing, cybercrime, and even human trafficking, Diego created a sprawling network that spanned continents. His organization operated like a multinational corporation with specialized divisions, logistics experts, and financial managers who laundered billions through a labyrinth of legitimate businesses. This diversification not only bolstered his profits but also made it far more difficult for law enforcement agencies to dismantle his empire. Diego's return to power was not without challenges. As his influence expanded, so did the scrutiny of international law enforcement. Interpol, the DEA, and intelligence agencies across the globe poured resources into tracking his activities. Joint task forces analyzed financial transactions, intercepted communications, and recruited informants within his ranks. But Diego had learned from his past mistakes. He operated under a complex web of pseudonyms and intermediaries, ensuring that no one could connect him directly to the criminal empire he controlled. What made Diego particularly formidable was his ability to weaponize technology. He hired hackers to infiltrate government systems, erase records, and plant false leads. His organization developed encrypted communication channels that were virtually impossible to penetrate. Through advanced data analytics, Diego's team identified patterns in law enforcement activity, allowing them to predict and evade raids. He even funded research into biometric spoofing, ensuring that his most trusted lieutenants could bypass security systems undetected. Diego also mastered the art of public perception. While his name remained a ghostly whisper in criminal circles, his legitimate businesses flourished in plain sight. Real estate developments, luxury resorts, and philanthropic initiatives bore no trace of their illicit origins. These ventures allowed him to ingratiate himself with powerful figures in politics and business, creating a network of allies who had a vested interest in his continued success. This strategy blurred the lines between legality and crime, making it increasingly difficult for authorities to prosecute him. Despite his careful planning, Diego faced an existential threat when one of his most trusted associates, Santiago Ortega, turned informant. Ortega, who had been with Diego since the early days of his empire, provided law enforcement with a treasure trove of intelligence. He revealed hidden supply routes, the names of key operatives, and even details of Diego's offshore accounts. The betrayal was devastating, but Diego's reaction was swift and calculated. Before authorities could capitalize on the information, Diego dismantled the compromised parts of his operation, cutting ties with anyone remotely linked to Ortega. Diego then turned his attention to Ortega himself. Despite being under heavy protection, Ortega was assassinated in a meticulously planned operation that left no trace of Diego's involvement. His death sent shockwaves through the criminal underworld and law enforcement alike. It was a stark reminder that Diego's reach extended far beyond the confines of his empire, and that betrayal was a risk no one could afford to take. In the years that followed, Diego's empire reached new heights. His control over global supply chains was so complete that he could manipulate market prices for drugs and weapons. Entire regions became economically dependent on his operations, with corrupt officials ensuring that his interests were protected. Diego also began investing in emerging markets for synthetic drugs, using his resources to dominate production and distribution. These ventures proved highly profitable, as they required fewer resources and carried less risk than traditional narcotics. Yet, with every expansion, Diego grew increasingly isolated. He trusted no one completely, relying only on a small inner circle that operated on a strictly need-to-know basis. His paranoia was not without cause. Law enforcement continued to pursue him relentlessly, and rival cartels were constantly plotting his downfall. Diego's life became one of constant movement and vigilance. He rarely stayed in one place for long, residing in fortified compounds guarded by private armies. His communications were encrypted, his transactions untraceable, and his public presence non-existent. Despite his efforts to maintain control, cracks began to appear in Diego's empire. One of his key distribution networks in Asia was compromised when local authorities intercepted a shipment worth hundreds of millions. The loss was significant, but more troubling was the revelation that the authorities had been tipped off by someone within his organization. This betrayal reignited Diego's paranoia, leading to another round of purges within his ranks. These actions, while effective in deterring further disloyalty, also created a climate of fear that strained the loyalty of his remaining operatives. Diego's health also began to deteriorate under the constant pressure. Years of stress, combined with his increasingly reclusive lifestyle, took a toll on his physical and mental well-being. He suffered from chronic insomnia, his mind racing with contingency plans and calculations at all hours. His once charismatic demeanor gave way to a cold, calculating presence that even his closest associates found unsettling. Diego's empire had become his prison, and he was acutely aware that his survival depended on maintaining the very system that was slowly destroying him. The tipping point came in 2019, when a coalition of international law enforcement agencies launched Operation Eclipse, a coordinated effort to dismantle Diego's empire once and for all. Over the course of several months, they conducted raids, froze assets, and arrested dozens of high-ranking members of his organization. The operation dealt a severe blow to Diego's network, disrupting supply chains and severing critical alliances. For the first time in years, Diego found himself on the defensive. But Diego was not a man to be underestimated. Even as his empire crumbled, he launched a counter-offensive that demonstrated the full extent of his cunning. Using forged intelligence, he tricked law enforcement into targeting rival cartels, creating chaos that allowed him to regain control of key territories. He also orchestrated a series of cyber attacks that crippled government databases, erasing records of his activities and delaying further investigations. These actions bought him time, but Diego knew that his position was no longer tenable. In the end, Diego Alvarez disappeared as mysteriously as he had re-emerged. His final act was to liquidate his remaining assets, funneling the proceeds into anonymous accounts across the globe. Then, like a ghost, he vanished, leaving behind a world that could only speculate about his fate. Some believed he had retired to a secluded island, living out his days in luxury and isolation. Others were convinced he had been killed, his death covered up by those who still feared his legacy. Diego's empire, though diminished, continued to operate in fragments, perpetuating the systems he had built. His name became the stuff of legend, a cautionary tale about the heights of power and the depths of ambition. For those who knew his story, Diego Alvarez was more than a man. He was a symbol of resilience, ruthlessness, and the enduring allure of power. Whether dead or alive, his shadow lingered over the world he had shaped, a reminder that some legacies are too vast to be erased. This concludes today's episode of Mystery Minds. The story of Diego Alvarez serves as a chilling reminder of how power can corrupt absolutely, and the devastating consequences of greed and violence. Thank you for joining us. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell so you never miss another deep dive into the world's most mysterious and shocking crimes. Until next time, stay curious and stay safe.